Now, the passage of Scripture that we have here this morning deals with an event that will set off a chain reaction of events that will eventually lead to the children of Israel's freedom from Egypt. This is the first of the 10 plagues. The Nile River is turned to blood. Exodus chapter 7 verse 14 says, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He refuses to let the people go. Get thee unto Pharaoh in the morning. He goeth out unto the water, and thou shalt stand by the river's bank against he come. And the rod which was turned to a serpent shalt thou take in thine hand. And thou shalt say unto him, The Lord of God of the Hebrews hath sent me unto thee, saying, Let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. And behold, hitherto thou wouldest not hear. Thus saith the Lord, In this thou shalt know that I am the Lord. Behold, I will smite with the rod and that is in mine hand upon the waters which are in the river, and they shall be turned to blood. And the fish that is in the river shall die, and the river shall stink, and the Egyptians shall loathe to drink of the water of the river. And the Lord spake unto Moses, Say unto Aaron, Take thy rod, and stretch out thine hand upon the waters of Egypt, upon their streams, upon their rivers, and upon their ponds, and upon all their pools of water, that they may become blood, and that there may be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in vessels of wood and vessels of stone. And Moses and Aaron did so, as the Lord commanded, and he lifted up the rod, and smote the waters that were in the river in the sight of Pharaoh, and in the sight of his servants, and all the waters that were in the river turned to blood. And the fish that was in the river died, and the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink of the water of the river, and there was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. And the magicians of Egypt did so with their enchantments, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened, neither did he hearken unto them, as the Lord had said. And Pharaoh turned and went into his house, neither did he set his heart to this also. And all the Egyptians digged round about the river for water to drink, for they could not drink of the water of the river. And the Bible goes on to say that this lasted for 7 days. In this first show of God's power to the Egyptians, in his attempt to get Pharaoh's attention that he would let the children of Israel go, God goes straight at the heart of Egyptian society. Without the Nile, Memphis, which was the capital city, would have just been a barren desert. Because without the Nile, they would have had no water to drink. Without the yearly flooding of the Nile, there would have been no way for their land to grow crops. It was essential for agriculture. There would have been no means of transportation. The Nile was also the way they transported goods from one place to another. The Nile River was so vital to their society that in Egyptian mythology, that river was considered sacred. It had many gods associated with it. The most important gods of their religion, gods like Hapi and Osiris and Iris, were associated with the Nile River. It was a holy thing. So here in this first plague, God is not just attacking, he's not just trying to get Pharaoh's attention with an assault on the Egyptian way of life. He is showing his dominance of the God of Israel over the gods of the nation of Egypt. Now, some have tried to explain this phenomenon, this river turning to blood, with various ways. They've said, well, it could have been silt, it could have been algae that bloomed, it could have been snow melt from the headwaters, but I think sometimes the mistake that we make in reading about things that happened so long ago is that we just assume people were stupider back then. I mean, we do. We just think, oh, it was old time. They didn't know the difference between muddy water and blood. But they had seen blood before. Blood has a different look. Blood has a different smell. Blood has a different consistency. If they believed that it turned blood, into blood, I don't think they would have been fooled by algae or silt. It was blood. Yeah. And at the same time, I've heard other people say, well, the magicians turned water into blood, so God allowed the magicians of the Egyptians to transform water into blood to harden Pharaoh's heart. I don't particularly believe that either, because if you look at ancient civilization, the art of magic, and I'm not talking about like black spells and stuff, but I'm talking about, the guys in the shiny tuxedos on TV that make the Statue of Liberty disappear. It's been around since the beginning of human civilization. So I have no doubt that, they got on their David Copperfield or David Blaine clothes and behold, the water becomes blood. And that was enough to convince Pharaoh because he believed that they were actually doing it. I don't think that this act by the magicians was supernatural. I think they were just, trying to get on a TV special. They were good magicians. And yet, that was enough. But here's the thing. They were able to, I'm assuming, it doesn't really say here in the Bible, to transform a vessel of water into blood, whether it was a jar or a big water pot even. That's quite different than turning not just one vessel of water, but all the water in all the vessels, and all the water in all the river, and the pools and the streams, and every drop of water that is in Egypt into blood. Quite different. But yet that was enough proof for Pharaoh to go, it was probably just, our gods are just as good as Moses' God. It's fine. It's fine. We won't do anything. As I studied this lesson, it occurred to me, think about how many times water shows up in stories in the Bible. Almost every time. We talked about several of those stories this morning. The woman at the well. There are all kinds of miracles throughout the Bible that involve water. You think about just the story of Moses. There was water that came from a rock. There was the Red Sea parting after Moses died and Joshua had taken over. The Jordan River parted. Later on, you have Elisha and an axe head that floats somehow. You have Naaman who's cured of leprosy by dipping in the Jordan River. You have later on in the Old Testament, you have Ezekiel with this vision of water flowing from the temple that just gets deeper and deeper. You think about the New Testament, more water miracles. Jesus walks on water. He calms a storm. We could go on and on. Time and time again, water appears in the Bible in miraculous context. But this is one of only 2 times that I can think of in the Bible. This story that we're reading right here this morning, this is one of only 2 times in the entirety of the Bible that the nature of water gets changed. Here in Exodus, we see the water turning to blood. What's the other instance of water being changed into something? Water being turned into wine. That's one of only 2. Although water is used in so many of these different miracles in the Bible, only 2 instances in the entirety of the Bible where water is changed from one thing to another. Water into blood, water into wine. The 2nd chapter of John tells us, of course, if you're not familiar with the story, that Jesus is called to a wedding. Conceivably, it was somebody in his family, because evidently they were in charge of refreshments. And Mary comes to him. We had this conversation at the dinner table this week. I was asking Sadie if she knew what Jesus' first miracle was, and I got to tell her this story. Mary comes to Jesus and says, "Jesus, we're out of wine." And Jesus says, "What do you want me to do about that?" Basically. And he says, "My time has not yet come." But Mary, being a good mother, goes on and says to the servants, "Whatever he tells you to do, you do it." So we know the story. Jesus, I guess, realizes that he should probably do something, because to run out of wine at a wedding, these were multi-day celebrations. It would have brought great shame on his family for them to run out. So Jesus goes and has the servants fill these giant water pots that they would have used for the ritual cleansing of their hands before they ate. He says, "Fill those water pots up." And after they'd filled the water pots up, he takes a cup and sends it by the servant to the master of the feast, the party planner, you might as well say. And at some point between that great water pot and the cup in his hand, all of that water, just like the blood in the vessels in Egypt turned to blood, at some point all of that becomes wine. And not just wine, it becomes really good wine. Like, Jesus doesn't do anything halfway. He doesn't just turn it into wine. It's like they take it to the master of the feast, and you can imagine him taking a drink and going, "Oh my gosh, that is most of the time, people wait until people are drunk before they serve the good stuff up front, and then they wait till people are drunk, and then they just serve them whatever swill they got in the back room. But you save the good stuff till now. One of only two, and if you look at it, these two stories, the water into blood, the water into wine, are mirror images of one another. Think about this. That was Jesus' first miracle. The water into blood is also the first plague of the Exodus. I don't think these are coincidences. If you look, they're mirror images of one another. Whereas the water into blood brings death and distress. All the fish die. The water stinks. People can't drink anything. Jesus brings life to a dying party. And he helps to celebrate one of life's most joyous occasions, a wedding, which we know later is a picture of Jesus' relationship with the church. They're mirror images of one another. And you might think at first blush, as I was studying, I thought, well, that's a neat coincidence. But I can't think that this is merely accidental. Like you would find out your friend and you have the same middle name or something. This cannot be an accident, because as I was telling those that were here a couple Wednesdays ago, I recently finished reading a biography of the Apostle Paul by N.T. Wright. It was super long, but it was super worth it. And the main takeaway for me is this, and this is a tangent, but we're going to get back into the main story here if you'll just bear with me for a second. When we see Saul on the road to Damascus, having that great conversion experience, sometimes we assume that his conversion was he used to be a Jew, and then after he meets Jesus, he's a Christian. That's how we frame it. But that's not at all how Paul saw what was going on. What Paul saw was that from the time he was young, he was part of a story that began with Abraham and proceeded through Moses and through the rest of the Old Testament. And when he meets Jesus on the road to Damascus, he's not saying, oh, I messed up by trusting in all that stuff. No, what he saw in Jesus was a fulfillment of what he had been learning his whole life. He was not thinking, I used to be this and now I'm this. He is seeing the life and death and resurrection of Jesus as a continuation of this story of Exodus from the Old Testament. It's all one big thing. That's why Paul goes and preaches to the Jews first, because they're the people that should understand more than anybody else that this hope that we have been waiting on, that's foretold in the Old Testament, has come. He does not see himself as preaching another religion. He's just got the whole picture finally. So when we see it the way, and that's a view that was shared by Jesus himself. If you look at the way he talks about himself and what he's doing, it's a view that you get from the early church. All the early church saw this thing, not as two separate religions, but as Christianity as the fulfillment of what was promised in the Old Testament. That's why in John chapter 1, just several verses before we get the story of Jesus' first miracle in Cana, we get John saying, for the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth by Jesus Christ. Who is Jesus compared to over and over in the New Testament? Not Abraham, not David. Jesus is directly and indirectly compared to Moses. Think about this. We could go on all day. When Jesus is born, what happens? What happens that happened also when Moses was born? There's a great slaughter of the innocents by the king, just like in Moses. When Jesus has to escape that king, where does he go? To Egypt. When Jesus, right before he starts his ministry, where does he go? To the desert. What did Moses do right before he started the work that God wanted him to do? Where was he at? The desert. Moses spent 40 years. Jesus spent 40 days. These are not just coincidences. What's clear is being telegraphed here. As Moses led the children of Israel to freedom out of Egypt, so Jesus, as a new and better Moses, is freeing all these on down faith. It's a continuation, as Paul and Jesus and the early church would have said, it's a continuation of the same story. Jesus is the culmination of that story. Moses is an Old Testament picture of Jesus, and Jesus is a new and better version of Moses. And of course, he's so much more, but that's what God is trying to telegraph to us here, that these are all the same story. Now, I want you to think about this. The first miracle of Jesus' ministry is a mirror image of the first plague of Egypt, as we've talked about. But what is the last image? What is the last act of Jesus' ministry? He's gathered with his disciples for a meal. What meal is it? Passover. What does Passover indicate? It is a celebration, a remembrance of not the first plague, but the last plague. The death of the firstborn and how Israel was delivered from Egypt. So here's Jesus observing a meal that is tied directly back. It's all one story. He's tied directly back into these plagues that we're going to learn about in these coming weeks. And in this Passover meal, let me turn over to Matthew here, Matthew's account of it. He says, he does something completely different. Jesus, being the rabbi, probably would have been the one in charge, and he would have been reciting the words and telling the story. And they would have been eating certain foods and drinking wine. There are, I think, 6 or 7 cups of wine that you drink throughout that Passover meal. But he takes that last cup, I believe it's the last cup, and he lifts it up. And keep in mind, his disciples were all Jewish, so they knew this script by heart, but Jesus completely flips it on its head. He takes a cup of wine and he says, "Drink ye all of it, for this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sins." Which we know very well. If you've ever taken communion, you've heard that story. But unless we realize that what Jesus is doing is acting out a culmination, a fulfillment of the story that begins in Egypt, we don't fully appreciate what Jesus is doing when he says, "This is my blood of the New Testament." Other translations have it as New. King James has it as Testament. Most other translations have it as, "This is my blood of the New Covenant." What is Jesus doing there? Jesus is quoting Moses. In chapter 24 of Exodus, you don't have to turn there, but Moses reads the law. Remember, the law comes by Moses, but grace and truth comes through Jesus. Moses is reading the law to the people. And he reads it, and the people respond to Moses, and they say, "All that the Lord hath said will we do, and be obedient." And what does Moses do? What does he do? He doesn't take a cup of wine. He takes a cup of blood and sprinkles it on the people and says, "Behold the blood of the covenant." Wow. Jesus is saying the same thing. "Behold, this is my blood of the new covenant." Moses says, "Behold the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made concerning all these words." Jesus says, "This is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for the remission of sins." Shed for many for the remissions of sins. Jesus, in this last act of his ministry, is directly quoting Moses, where Moses turned water into blood. Jesus turned water into wine, and now he has wine and he's turning it into blood. He does so at a meal to commemorate the final plague in the children of Israel's freedom. Where the plagues in Egypt were a sign of God's dominion over the Egyptian gods, the miracles and the works of Jesus, beginning with that cup of wine at Cana, ending with the cup of wine in Jerusalem, and continuing when he sheds his blood for a covenant on the cross of Calvary, don't just show his power over these false gods. David says the gods of the nations are nothing, but the Lord made the heavens. Doesn't just show his dominance over these false gods. Jesus is showing his power and might over every force of the enemy. This is the whole story of the Bible. Slavery and deliverance. As we continue in the next several weeks, the rest of our quarterly, we're going to be learning about Moses and how God delivered the children of Israel from bondage in Egypt. And as we do that, I hope that we always look at Moses for what he is. A forerunner, a foretelling, a picture of that great leader, that great Messiah that came and didn't just free us from physical bondage, but freed us from every bondage that the enemy ever tried to put us through. It's part one. We might think of this as cute little Bible stories. It's good to know. But it's so important that we know this Old Testament because it is part one of a story that reaches its fulfillment in Jesus. The powers of the world might refuse freedom. We might say, let me go. And they might say, no, not a chance. Their hearts might be hardened. The powers of the world can do everything in their power to preserve our slavery. But if we learn anything from Exodus, and if we learn anything from the great redemption story that continues and reaches its fulfillment in the New Testament, it is that God, one way or another, always gets His way. God always wins. God has already won. The law came by Moses. And the law was important. The law told them how they ought to live. But as Paul tells us later in the New Testament, the law also proved to us how helpless, and even when they were freed from the bondage of Egypt, even after they didn't have slave masters over them, they were still servants to what? Sin. They were still servants to sin. They were still slaves to sin. And the law showed them how deep that slavery ran and how impossible it was to break free of it. The law was a schoolmaster, Paul tells us. But Jesus came that He might set the captive free, once and for all. We're free, but not just free, free indeed, through Jesus, that better and final Moses. There was a bluegrass group that had a song out, My God Will Send a Moses. He already did. Jesus, the Messiah, the deliverer. We're free. All we have to do is want that freedom. That's my lesson.